The girl brought her boyfriend home to do something you'd love to know, but I can't say. But just at the crucial moment, the boy's nose suddenly started bleeding, and then he lost control of his body and died on the spot. Zoe was devastated inside. She didn't understand why every boyfriend she had ended up mysteriously dead. It wasn't until this moment that she learned the truth from her mother. It turned out that their family had been witches for generations, and Zoe had inherited the powers of a witch as well. At that moment, several men suddenly burst into their house, and Zoe's mom just stood aside. She watched helplessly as her daughter was forcibly taken away by the men. Zoe was then sent to a mysterious witch academy, which was completely empty inside. Just when Zoe thought it was some kind of prank, a few people dressed in black appeared, and in the blink of an eye, Zoe was pinned down. The figures in black then removed their hoods one by one, and the three began to introduce themselves: Madison, Queenie, and Nan. They were all students at the Witch Academy, and the only students there, the headmistress, Cordelia, was a beautiful middle-aged woman. Cordelia explained to Zoe the history of witches, and the reason there were so few students was because witches were almost extinct. Many witches, upon discovering their abilities, chose to live out their lives in solitude. A few months ago, there was a witch with an amazing power, the ability to bring the dead back to life. She could forcibly pull a dead person's soul back from the other side and revive them, but this power was regarded as sorcery by ordinary people. So one night, the witch was caught by a mob and burned at the stake. Meanwhile, a supreme witch was sitting in front of the television. She had a wish to become a beautiful young woman. Fiona then demanded that David develop something that could restore her youth. She was not just a woman but also a supreme witch. While the man was Fiona's personal doctor, Fiona wanted David to develop a drug that could turn her into a young lady. David said that as long as there was money, anything was possible, but he actually had no way of accomplishing Fiona's request. The next day, David went to Fiona's house again and found that she seemed mentally unstable. David thought Fiona had gone mad and said he wasn't up to the task. Before he could finish speaking, Fiona's mere gaze shut all the doors and windows in the room. Terrified, David turned to leave, but with a wave of Fiona's hand, he collapsed to the floor. Clearly unable to comprehend such supernatural powers, he begged Fiona to let him go, but under David's horrified gaze, Fiona used her magic to control his body. Within seconds, David had shriveled into a skeleton, while a radiant Fiona stood before the mirror, admiring herself. But in the blink of an eye, the signs of aging returned to her face, and she angrily smashed the mirror. Meanwhile, since arriving at the academy, Zoe had been getting along very well with her three new friends. They went to a bar to hang out, and in a daze, Zoe saw a boy who stood out from the crowd. He said his name was Kyle. The moment he saw Zoe, he fell in love with her, and Zoe admitted that she liked him too. But unfortunately, the two of them weren't meant to be together. Just as Zoe was about to leave, she noticed that Madison had fallen unconscious. Zoe, realizing something was wrong, rushed out, trying to catch the culprit. Kyle had already chased after the bus but was beaten down by a group of thugs. As the bus drove farther away, Zoe let out a powerless roar. At that moment, Madison calmly walked over and, after gathering her thoughts, waved her hand, causing the bus ahead to crash. Zoe was in complete panic because Kyle was on that bus. The next day, the news reported a bizarre accident from the previous night. 9 members of a fraternity were on the bus, 7 of whom died on the spot, while 2 were taken to the hospital. Zoe confronted Madison, saying they should tell the headmistress about it. At that moment, Fiona slowly approached. As a supreme witch, she could immediately tell that this was Madison's doing. With a wave of Fiona's hand, Madison flew straight into the wall. Then, under the leadership of Fiona, the supreme witch, the 4 young witches followed behind her. Nan, who had the magical talent of clairaudience, seemed to hear something strange, and Zoe took the opportunity to sneak into the hospital. She was very worried about Kyle's condition, but when she entered the room, she found that the survivor of the bus crash wasn't Kyle. Seeing the badly injured student, Zoe seemed to make a major decision. She quickly closed the hospital room door, and soon the student was dead under Zoe's intimate assault. Meanwhile, Nan said she heard the mistress's voice there, and Fiona seemed to understand something, so she waited for nightfall and dug up a coffin hidden in the ground, revealing a bound woman inside. Fiona was very pleased, as this was exactly the woman she had been looking for. The next day, Headmistress Cordelia woke the students for a morning meeting, but Fiona said she was busy brewing a potion. Little did anyone know that the woman, Delphine, was still tied up in Fiona's room. After securing Delphine, Fiona left. Later, 2 police officers came to the Witch Academy to investigate the student's death. They had found a connection between Madison and Zoe and the dead students on the bus. The police also knew that Zoe had visited the hospital to see a fellow student who later died under similar circumstances to Zoe's ex-boyfriend. Zoe pleaded with the officers not to throw her in jail. At the critical moment, Fiona arrived just in time and declared that everything at the school was under her control. She then filled 2 cups with water from the cooler and demanded that the 2 tough guys drink it. The police were frightened out of their wits and struggled to resist Fiona's magic. Knowing they were close to breaking, Fiona demanded that the 2 officers hand over all their files on Zoe. As Zoe and Madison argued heatedly, Fiona burst in and, with a wave of her hand, sent Madison flying. Watch closely as this woman puts her arm into the boiling oil. But strangely, the police officer's arm is suddenly burned instead. That's right, the woman is a skilled witch who can transfer any harm done to herself onto someone else, which is why Headmistress Cordelia brought her to the Witch Academy. Under Madison's lead, Zoe sneaked with her to the hospital morgue. Madison knew that Zoe couldn't stop thinking about the deceased Kyle, so she stole a magical scroll called the Resurrection Spell. She wanted to bring Kyle back to life. The 2 entered the morgue, where several dismembered bodies were laid out. Madison unzipped one of the body bags, revealing Kyle's corpse, which terrified Zoe. Madison suggested they could piece together the limbs and attach them to Kyle's head. That way, they could create the perfect boyfriend for Zoe. Despite Madison's spell, Kyle didn't move, leaving Madison disappointed as she left the morgue. Zoe was heartbroken as she stared at Kyle in front of her. Just then, a security guard entered the morgue and saw Zoe. Before Zoe could react, Kyle suddenly came back to life behind the guard. After killing the guard, Zoe escaped with Kyle. Since his limbs weren't his own, Kyle was nearly out of control, punching the car repeatedly, almost smashing it to pieces. Zoe tried her best to calm Kyle down, but it was no use. A woman suddenly appeared, and Zoe was frightened. The woman took them to a cabin in the woods and applied a large amount of medicine to Kyle's stitched wounds, saying it would help him heal. The woman introduced herself as Misty, and said the same medicine had healed her from injuries a few months ago. Zoe finally recognized the woman. She was the one the headmistress had mentioned, the witch who could bring the dead back to life. Fiona told Delphine she would have to serve as a maid for the academy, or she'd be locked back in the coffin. Delphine had no choice but to agree. However, Delphine insulted Queenie, who was not one to back down. Fiona arrived at that moment. Instead of helping Delphine, she handed over Delphine's ownership entirely to Queenie. Meanwhile, Misty had completely healed Kyle, but he had lost all his memories and couldn't recognize who Zoe was. Misty seemed a bit off, almost obsessed with Kyle. After Zoe and Kyle left, Misty danced around like a madwoman. Zoe brought Kyle home and then bolted out the door, while Kyle's mother was overjoyed to see her son back. She didn't know that Kyle had lost all his memories, and no matter how much she talked to him, he didn't respond, making her doubt whether he was truly alive. Now, Kyle looked more like a living corpse, and the police had already reported his death. With the dead returning to life, his mother was on the verge of a breakdown. She knew Kyle's body better than anyone else, even intimately. But now, this body was different. Overwhelmed with emotion, she turned away. Just then, Kyle let out a loud scream and grabbed a nearby object, smashing it against his mother's head. Cut to Fiona teaching Madison how to make someone lose the will to live. All you need is imagination, then impose your will on the man. Seeing the man before her nearly dead, Madison felt a twisted sense of joy. It seemed her understanding of magic had deepened. Fiona noticed Madison's progress and believed she had the potential to become the next Supreme Witch. Back at the academy, Fiona told Madison that her portrait would soon hang on the wall because she was destined to be the next Supreme. Fiona explained that she herself was the current Supreme Witch, but her time was running out, because Madison was draining her life force, and her power was growing exponentially with time. Madison confirmed it, saying that's exactly what was happening. Fiona finally snapped, her powers waning day by day, all because Madison was absorbing her magic. She could feel her own life force leaving her body and flowing into Madison's. Fiona said the portrait on the wall belonged to her teacher, the previous Supreme Witch. She had once slit her teacher's throat with her own hands to become the Supreme herself. She told Madison to take the dagger and end her life, and they could make it official. As they struggled, Madison's throat was slit, and she collapsed, dying in the same manner as Fiona's mentor. Flashback to a deep night decades ago, when Fiona was still a young, beautiful witch, and her mentor was the Supreme of that generation. Fiona asked her mentor how she became the Supreme, and the mentor didn't avoid the question, instead telling Fiona the truth. She said that an exceptional witch could master 5 powers, but she herself could perfectly perform the 7 wonders. Eager to prove herself, Fiona claimed she was ready because when a new supreme is about to emerge, the current one would gradually weaken. Fiona knew this secret well, which was why she constantly provoked her teacher. She killed her teacher with ease. Back in the present, the situation was eerily similar to many years ago. Fiona killed her teacher to become the supreme witch, and now she had killed her student to prevent the next supreme from taking over. Later that night, Delphine was preparing some meat for Queenie. Suddenly, she noticed something flash by the window. As she approached to take a closer look, a minotaur rammed into the door, terrifying Delphine. She quickly locked the door. Queenie thought Delphine was having a mental breakdown, so she went to open the door, only to have the minotaur start banging against it furiously. Delphine said the minotaur was her servant and that the bull's head was placed on him by her orders 180 years ago. Now, he had become more beast than man. Clearly, the minotaur had been cursed with the same dark magic for immortality as herself. Queenie realized Delphine was no ordinary person after living for 180 years. Queenie became furious, but Delphine was already scared out of her wits by the minotaur outside. She just wanted to hide somewhere safe. Then Queenie pulled out a knife, cut Delphine, and said she'd handle everything from here. But as soon as Queenie opened the door to leave, she was knocked to the ground by the minotaur. Before Fiona could even breathe a sigh of relief, she found Queenie gravely injured, barely clinging to life, and muttering the minotaur's name. Fiona didn't understand what Queenie was saying, and then the minotaur slowly appeared behind her. The outcome was predictable. The minotaur was taken down by Fiona on the spot, and Queenie was rescued, but her injuries were too severe for the salve made by Headmistress Cordelia to have any effect. Without effective treatment, Queenie quickly lost all signs of life. Fiona rushed forward to perform healing, and soon after, Queenie's heartbeat returned. Meanwhile, Kyle was nearly out of his mind, banging his head against the bathtub. Zoe wiped the blood off his face and then went to find something for Kyle to eat. But when she came back, Kyle had disappeared, and there was no sign of him outside either. When Zoe looked into the distance, she noticed that everyone seemed off, leaving her completely stunned. At the same time, the council sent 3 investigators to the Witch Academy. Cordelia was anxious because the council only appeared when situations were dire. At the critical moment, Fiona arrived just in time to alleviate Cordelia's awkwardness. The council stated that they were there to investigate Madison's disappearance. Nan said she could no longer hear Madison's voice and suspected that Madison had been killed. With Madison mysteriously missing, there was suspicion of Fiona's involvement. Knowing Fiona was extremely skilled at deception, they demanded that everyone at the academy write down the name of the culprit on a piece of paper. Under the council's pressure, the butler truthfully confessed all of Fiona's crimes. After seeing the truth, Myrtle felt like she was about to go insane. Cordelia said that Madison wasn't the next supreme witch. There was someone else. Fiona was shocked by Cordelia's explanation, realizing she had killed the wrong person. Meanwhile, Marie was at her hair salon when a strange large box was delivered. Marie opened it to find a blinking bull's head inside. She knew this was definitely connected to the Witch Academy, so she decided to use magic to take revenge on the academy. Marie began performing dark magic to summon the dead buried in the cemetery to avenge the Minotaur. At the same time, the witches at the academy were celebrating Halloween when a sudden, urgent knock was heard. Delphine opened the door to find 3 undead standing outside. Delphine looked at them in terror. One of them was her youngest daughter, who had been dead for many years. Delphine, frightened out of her wits, quickly shut the door. They didn't realize that the entire Witch Academy was completely surrounded by countless undead. Cordelia wasn't at the academy. She was getting drunk at a bar. Fiona asked Cordelia who the next supreme was, but Cordelia only smiled and remained silent. Cordelia, a little tipsy, went to the bathroom to sober up. A mysterious figure in black suddenly appeared, and Cordelia was caught off guard and attacked. Her blood-curdling scream drew Fiona's attention, and Fiona saw the figure in black leaving. At the hospital, the doctor said Cordelia was completely blind. The sudden news almost shattered Fiona's emotional defenses. Meanwhile, the young witches had discovered that the academy was surrounded by a horde of strange people. Zoe urgently called Fiona for help, but couldn't get through. One of the students, thinking it was a special Halloween event, went outside to chase the undead away, but before he could react, 2 more teenagers approached, also thinking it was a party. At that moment, Marie's body slowly rose into the air, and then her eyes shot open. The undead army, as if receiving orders, began attacking the teenagers. The teenagers who had been watching in amusement immediately turned and fled in terror. Seeing one of the teenagers in danger, Nan stepped in to help. The two ran to a car, but the vehicle was soon smashed to pieces by the undead wielding weapons. Zoe made a noise in the distance to draw the attention of the undead but was quickly cornered in a dark room. Meanwhile, Delphine hid in the kitchen, chipping away at some ice. When she heard a noise outside the window again, Delphine rushed to look and saw the undead standing outside. It was her long-dead daughter. She was the most unfortunate woman I'd ever seen, forced to watch her daughter suffer because of a dark magic curse that granted her immortality. Unable to bear seeing her daughter in such pain, Delphine resolutely opened the door, believing there was still some humanity left in her child. The undead daughter grabbed Delphine by the neck and then headed for Queenie's room. Seeing the horrifying undead, Queenie was so scared she nearly wet herself. She quickly pulled out a pair of scissors and cast a spell. Queenie was stunned. The undead wasn't afraid of injury and couldn't be killed. Just as Queenie was about to die of fright, Delphine arrived in time and completely destroyed the undead daughter. Queenie trembled as she finally dared to move her feet. The undead were still roaming around the Witch Academy when Zoe stepped outside with a chainsaw to fight them. The undead came at Zoe like a wave of grass being cut down. Within seconds, Zoe had killed most of the undead, but when facing the last one, the chainsaw broke, and she backed away in terror. The undead kept advancing, and in a daze, Zoe raised her hand, causing the undead to fall, and Marie plummeted from the sky. Marie said, though she didn't know what had happened, the Witch Academy had finally shown its true power. The next day, after returning to the academy, they burned the bodies of the undead to ashes. Delphine also came, watching her daughter's body turn to dust, her heart full of helplessness. At that moment, the three council members arrived again. With the Witch Academy recently under multiple attacks and Headmistress Cordelia blind, they had the right to demand Fiona step down as the Supreme, but Fiona was prepared. She shifted the topic to Myrtle, accusing her of harming Cordelia. They raised Fiona's arm and found burn marks. Myrtle was then tied to a stake, and Fiona lit the fire, quickly turning Myrtle into a chart figure. The burn marks on Myrtle's hands were entirely Queenie's doing. It seems that someone else harmed Cordelia, and Myrtle was merely a scapegoat for Fiona. After everyone left the execution site, Misty appeared. Later, Zoe went to the room to tidy up some things when a bottle suddenly rolled across the floor. Stopping in another room, Zoe sensed something and opened the closet to check, accidentally discovering a hidden chamber. Rummaging through the space, Zoe found a strange spirit-calling compass. She quickly called in two other friends to examine the various photos found in the secret room. Strange events followed one after another. Zoe decided to use a summoning ritual to find Madison. As they couldn't afford to lose another witch, she poured each friend a cup of bitter liquor, which helps in communicating with evil spirits. Queenie was already spooked and said there were two stages to using the summoning ritual. A long time ago, her grandmother had summoned a spirit, but it turned out to be an evil spirit, and the result was that half of her grandmother's face was burned off. But Zoe didn't care about any of that. She only wanted to find Madison quickly, and the ritual began immediately. Queenie was terrified and begged to stop the ritual because she calculated that this time, it would definitely summon an evil spirit. Meanwhile, Misty had returned to her place and was burying Myrtle in the ground, watering the grave with a special, foul-smelling fertilizer. Just then, Kyle appeared behind Misty, and she felt a unique affection for him. But when Misty made affectionate gestures toward him, Kyle's mind was filled with memories of his mother. Back at the ritual, the three failed to communicate with the spirit, and Queenie fled. Not wanting to continue playing the Ouija game, Zoe was furious, never expecting Queenie to be such a coward, so she returned to the room to summon the spirit alone. During the seance, Zoe learned that Madison was dead and that her body was hidden in the attic of the Witch Academy. Zoe hurried to the attic to search for clues. Although it was dark, everything was neatly arranged. She quickly noticed something unusual and, after opening a box beneath a teddy bear, found Madison's body hidden there. At that moment, the butler suddenly appeared. During their struggle, Zoe broke free from his grip. She grabbed something and knocked the butler unconscious. Not long after he woke up, Zoe had already called her friends over to brutally interrogate him, but the butler wasn't worried because he knew the witches had secrets to hide. Madison was already dead, and killing the butler wouldn't change anything. Zoe decided to visit someone who might be able to bring Madison back to life. Zoe eventually found Misty, who was curious as to why Kyle was there, but there was no time to explain. So Zoe handed Madison's body over to Misty, since Misty was highly skilled at reviving the dead. Although Madison's limbs had been damaged before her death, Misty hesitated to help. After Zoe's insistence, Misty finally decided to help revive Madison. They applied soil to the severed limbs to regenerate Madison's body, and Misty began casting the spell. In just 3 seconds, Madison turned her head and spat out blood. That night, Madison was brought back to the Witch Academy, but problems emerged. Her memory seemed fragmented, and she couldn't recall the moment she was killed. In her confusion, all she could remember was a flash of something red. After losing her sight, Cordelia returned to the Witch Academy, where an evil spirit summoned by Zoe through the seance appeared. The spirit pinned blind Cordelia against the wall, saying he had died in that very room. Cordelia then realized the man before her was already dead, and his soul was trapped here. The man said that the previous night, a young witch had summoned him and made a promise to set him free after completing a task. But at the last moment, the witch had deceived him, and now he was going to kill Cordelia to make the witch who betrayed him pay. Cordelia screamed in terror, and Madison's interrogators rushed to her door, but it was locked and wouldn't open. That's when Queenie understood. Zoe had summoned the Axeman through the Ouija game the night before. Cordelia was paralyzed with fear. Unable to move in the dark, she cowered in a corner, trembling. Zoe hurried to the library with her friends to find the exorcism book hidden on the shelf. The three formed a circle and began chanting. Candles suddenly ignited, and the Axeman vanished. But by then, Cordelia was in complete shock. They didn't realize the Axeman had transformed into a dark figure and was slowly leaving the academy. In the blink of an eye, the man appeared beside Fiona. Could his presence make Fiona sense the danger? Meanwhile, Madison slowly regained her memory. As a resurrected person, she had lost her sense of taste, but with some nourishment, her complexion grew healthier, and she seemed more sinister. Now, she could no longer feel even the most basic sensations of pain. Could Madison still live like a normal person? After learning about this, Zoe faced a difficult moral dilemma. She finally took a Barrett rifle and went to Kyle, but Kyle was no longer the person he used to be, and Zoe felt she had committed an unforgivable sin. Sensing Zoe's good intentions, Kyle grabbed the rifle and prepared to end his life. Zoe couldn't bear to let Kyle die and rushed to stop him. The gunshot shattered the glass ceiling, causing shards to rain down. Zoe broke down, hugging Kyle and crying uncontrollably. On the other hand, blind Cordelia was left without help. Calling out for the butler in the darkness, a figure suddenly appeared behind her, and Cordelia's magic activated involuntarily. She saw the entire process of Madison's murder by Fiona. Cordelia had uncovered the truth. The next day, Cordelia approached Zoe and revealed her relationship with Fiona. They were mother and daughter, but her mother had killed Madison since Madison had the potential to become the supreme witch. Fiona didn't want her to rise to power. Cordelia believed that Zoe, like Madison, had the potential to become the supreme, so she warned Zoe that Fiona might target her too. Fiona was ruthless, so Cordelia decided to join forces with Zoe to take her down. Finally, Zoe felt a sense of urgency after Cordelia's warning. Cordelia was right. None of them could defeat Fiona alone. Only by working together would they have a chance to fight her. Meanwhile, Queenie took the opportunity to visit the voodoo queen, Marie. Marie led Queenie to a courtyard filled with hanging vines and asked about Delphine's whereabouts. But Queenie refused to betray Delphine, who was a servant at the Witch Academy. Under Marie's watchful eye, Queenie drank the special potion prepared for her. Queenie, though timid, sought refuge with Marie, the enemy. Marie demanded that Queenie bring Delphine to her as proof of her allegiance. After careful consideration, Queenie decided to follow Marie's orders. She returned to the academy to find Delphine and asked her what the worst thing she'd ever done was. But Delphine thought it was too painful to recall. Queenie said they were kindred spirits because her mom once told her that only by knowing the ugliness in one's heart could people become true friends. Delphine remembered something that happened 180 years ago. There was once a newborn whose blood she drank completely. This was also her secret to staying youthful, trading youth for youth. This was the worst thing she thought she'd ever done, and Queenie was horrified. Meanwhile, Zoe was casting a spell on a piece of meat. After finishing the incantation, she pressed the meat against the butler's mouth. This meat was the butler's tongue, which he had cut out 40 years ago to keep Fiona's secret. The butler slowly woke up in the attic, finding himself tightly bound to the bed. He quickly noticed something unusual. He suddenly had a tongue again. Zoe said she found the tongue in a secret room, but she hadn't expected a tongue preserved for 40 years to still be moist and not dried out. It was clear that the tongue had been enchanted. The butler was stunned by Zoe's investigative skills and had no choice but to confess the truth. The butler claimed that he wasn't the one who killed Madison, but he couldn't bring himself to say the name. Under Zoe's pressure, the butler finally revealed the killer's identity. He thought he had betrayed the Supreme Witch Fiona and brought shame upon his family. But Zoe didn't intend to let the butler go that easily. She finished him off with a knife. Queenie tricked Delphine into a dark room, and suddenly, a terrifying voice emerged. Turning around, Delphine saw that Marie had arrived with people, surrounding her completely. Delphine was terrified. She knew Queenie had betrayed her, and soon Delphine found herself trapped in an iron cage, letting out desperate cries. Marie then ordered Queenie to find a heart for a ritual. Queenie, following orders, went out that night to find the perfect target for Marie. At that moment, a homeless man appeared, though he never expected to stumble into becoming prey. Queenie took the opportunity to grab a wooden board nearby and struck the homeless man down. Zoe and Madison arrived, trying to stop Queenie from committing more violence, but Queenie's heart had already turned. In front of her two friends, Queenie took the homeless man's heart. She said Marie was making a special potion that would make her stronger. There would inevitably be a showdown, and Queenie declared that she would be the ultimate victor. The next day, Zoe and Madison told Cordelia about Queenie's betrayal, and Cordelia said losing Queenie was her failure. But now, no one else could be allowed to defect. The group then discussed a battle plan. Zoe believed they should kill Fiona, as it was an urgent matter. Madison volunteered to kill Fiona, but Cordelia said Madison was their trump card, and Fiona couldn't know she had been resurrected. They only had one chance to kill Fiona, and the plan had to be flawless. Otherwise, all of them together wouldn't stand a chance against Fiona. At that moment, there was a frantic knock at the door. Zoe hurried to check and found Misty at the door. Misty looked panicked and said someone was trying to kill her. Last night, a man in black came to her place with a gun and shot at her bed multiple times, so she came here for help. Cordelia walked over slowly to show goodwill, extending her hand, but when she touched Misty, Cordelia saw her past. Misty had always been an exceptionally kind witch in all her lives, and Cordelia declared that no matter what happened, the Coven would stand by her. From now on, Misty would be under the protection of the Coven, and that's when Misty remembered that her friend was also here. The group then went to the secret room, where the resurrected Myrtle appeared. She said Misty had brought her back to life, and perhaps Misty would be the next Supreme Witch. Meanwhile, Kyle was already caught up in a complicated love triangle, unexpectedly involved with both Madison and Zoe. Zoe thought Kyle should learn and reintegrate into society, but Madison just wanted the three of them to enjoy themselves together. The group then began to implement their battle plan. They donned red witch cloaks and prepared for the sacred taking ceremony. The sacred taking ceremony could only be performed when the Coven faced a crisis. A long time ago, the ceremony was conducted when the Coven decided to move south to escape persecution from the ultimate tribunal, and the reigning Supreme was near death. The Supreme gathered all the witches to perform the sacred taking, the most noble and sacred sacrifice of a Supreme. But the question remained, would Fiona commit suicide for the future of the Coven? The answer was undoubtedly no. At this moment, Fiona had no idea she was already a lamb to the slaughter. She entered the living room and saw a girl in red dancing, thinking it was a hallucination until Madison spoke. Fiona was stunned. Madison had been killed by her own hands. How could she be dancing here? It wasn't until then that Fiona realized Madison had been resurrected. Then Fiona fell into a deep dream. After taking sleeping pills, the butler, who had died, suddenly appeared in her vision. He warned Fiona not to be deceived by the young girls and handed her a vial, asking her to drink it. But Fiona refused. She believed it was a noble act, but the butler said she had been deceived and that Madison wasn't the next Supreme. She was merely resurrected by a swamp witch, and this was all a lie. Fiona then realized the truth and took the potion handed to her by the butler. She went to the bathroom to vomit up the sleeping pills and expressed her gratitude to the butler. Meanwhile, Delphine seemed resigned to her fate in captivity. Queenie showed no remorse and gave Delphine a hamburger as her last meal. Marie then arrived and ordered Queenie to leave, as Marie's hatred for Delphine was insatiable, and merely imprisoning her wasn't enough. But Delphine was already under Marie's dark magic, making her immortal. And when faced with Delphine's extreme insults, Marie lost her temper and swung the blade down. Meanwhile, the people at the academy had no idea that Fiona had recovered. Myrtle was happily playing the piano when Fiona suddenly appeared behind them. She didn't attack the witches who had tried to harm her but showed great interest in Misty's resurrection abilities. As the Supreme Witch, Fiona found it incredibly easy to locate Misty, finding her next door where a shooting had occurred. Myrtle expressed her eagerness to watch a resurrection, leaving Misty no choice but to perform the ritual. Within seconds, the woman who had been shot came back to life. Meanwhile, Cordelia was on her way toward Misty's location when she noticed a tiny object. Picking it up, she saw a clear vision. The woman's death was just an accident, and the true target was the witches of the academy. The next day, Fiona went to the door and found a strange box sitting right in front of it. She looked around but saw no one nearby, so she used magic to sense if there was any danger inside. After detecting no threats, she brought the box back inside, but when they opened it, they were stunned. Fiona then took the box to Marie, but Marie's eyes were filled with hostility when she looked at Fiona. The two went into a back room, where Fiona saw Delphine's headless body, still able to wave its hands despite missing its head. Fiona tried to persuade Marie to form an alliance, and as she spoke, Delphine's head in the box started talking. Fiona, unable to stand the chatter, stuffed a paper ball into Delphine's mouth. Fiona then took out a silver bullet and said that a group of witch hunters was actively targeting witches. Though they couldn't stand each other, they were both part of the witch race. If the witch academy fell, Marie would also be in danger, but Marie didn't care about the consequences and forcefully kicked Fiona out. Elsewhere, the blind Cordelia was doing housework like any other blind person, with Myrtle watching coldly. It wasn't until Cordelia broke an egg that Myrtle stepped in to help, but Cordelia was upset, insisting that Myrtle was the one who had made her blind. Myrtle understood that Cordelia was mistaken and decided to clear things up, explaining that she had been wronged. Myrtle said she would never hurt Cordelia because she loved her like a daughter. Meanwhile, Cordelia's husband was secretly receiving orders at a company in New Orleans. Yes, Hank was a witch hunter who had only stayed close to Cordelia to gather intelligence and take down both the voodoo and witch covens. Their relationship had already fallen apart, and Hank didn't care about emotions as he prepared for the next step. Myrtle, on the other hand, had called two former allies to join her under the blood moon and made a bowl of grapes to entertain them. The two were unsuspecting and easily fell into Myrtle's trap. In the end, with horror in their eyes, Myrtle took out an ear spoon and scooped out the woman's eye with just a light flick. She then installed the eyes into Cordelia's glasses, restoring her vision. Cordelia, now able to see, cultivated magical herbs with Misty in the kitchen. The herbs could repel evil. At that moment, Cordelia's husband Hank returned, only to find that Cordelia had regained her sight. As a witch hunter, Hank had a strong mind, and even Cordelia's second sight couldn't detect his murderous intent. But Cordelia had no feelings for Hank anymore and told him to leave. Then Hank saw Misty approaching and suddenly remembered the time he had attacked her. He was the man in black who had ambushed Misty before. Cordelia didn't want to hear Hank's excuses and demanded that he take all his belongings with him. As he walked away, a dog appeared in Hank's path, making him freeze in fear. Luckily, Fiona arrived just in time to stop the dog from attacking him, then threw the dog into a room. Kyle was hiding there, but before Fiona could react, she heard chewing sounds behind her. Hank quickly donned his witch hunter gear after leaving the academy, seemingly preparing for action. But who would his target be? Meanwhile, the young witches returned to the academy, only to find Fiona playing cards with Kyle. They were unsure of what was going on. They soon noticed that Kyle seemed to have regained some of his senses, but he hadn't fully recovered. In another part of the city, Delphine, still just ahead, kept laughing and insulting Queenie. Queenie, knowing she had wronged Delphine, did nothing in response. After Queenie left, Hank kicked down the door and barged in, opening fire on everyone inside. Queenie froze in terror and was eventually shot. The hair salon was nearly turned into a bloodbath, with Queenie using all her strength to crawl toward a fallen gun. Marie appeared after hearing the gunfire, but when she saw the weapon in Hank's hand, she was completely stunned. As Hank aimed at Marie, Queenie intervened just in time and killed Hank. Meanwhile, Delphine, still only ahead, wept, seemingly realizing what had just happened. Hank's father wept with regret when he heard the news. Later that night, Marie, who had narrowly escaped, was approached by a soul dealer. The man, named Papa, came every year to collect the souls of newborns from Marie, and today marked the day for his yearly collection. Though terrified, Marie had no choice but to serve Papa, eventually making her way to a hospital to find a newborn. Staring at the helpless infants, Marie didn't hesitate for a second. A nurse tried to intervene, but Marie simply turned and sprayed a mist, making the nurse obediently open the door for her. Marie searched the nursery several times before taking one of the babies. As she left the hospital, two police officers arrived just in time to intercept her. Both sides were at a standoff, and with time running out, Marie had no choice but to use magic to kill the two police officers. Now, no one could stop her from taking the baby. Fiona had long desired immortality, believing that Papa might have the power to grant her wish. So, she made a deal with Marie to finally obtain the summoning method for Papa. That night, Fiona cast a spell to summon the soul dealer, Papa. As the man appeared before her, Fiona expressed her frustration. She didn't want to die, she wanted to be immortal like Marie because she believed she was different from everyone else. Seeing this, Papa reminded Fiona that if she wanted immortality, she would have to sell her soul and could never refuse any of Papa's future demands. Fiona, overwhelmed with desperation, eagerly agreed to Papa's terms. Longing to become a young, beautiful woman again, Papa then tried to sense Fiona's soul but abruptly said the deal was off. He discovered that Fiona didn't have a soul at all, making it impossible to strike an agreement. His words shattered Fiona's inner resolve. Meanwhile, Nan's magical abilities were growing stronger, and she believed she might be the next supreme witch. But then, she heard the sudden cry of a baby, prompting her to follow the sound to a wardrobe in a room where the baby was hidden. Marie appeared, demanding that Nan hand over the baby, but Nan had already read Marie's thoughts. Marie recognized Nan as the mind-reading witch. Before Marie could react, Fiona suddenly appeared, but instead of helping Nan, Fiona sided with Marie, demanding the baby from Nan. Nan seemed to realize something and gave the baby to them. After Nan left, Fiona and Marie conspired to kill her. Later that night, the two of them held Nan underwater, and in just 3 seconds, Nan was dead. Papa appeared before them, and Marie said that this girl was their sacrificial soul and that she was pure. Papa sensed that the two had joined forces, and while it was troublesome, he would accept any soul offering. Nan's spirit appeared behind Papa, and she showed no fear. Instead, she calmly followed Papa away. The next day, everyone held a grand funeral for Nan, saying she had accidentally drowned in the bathtub. No one questioned the story, but then Queenie suddenly appeared, tying up Delphine's hands and reattaching her head to her body. They had now allied to face the witch hunters. After returning to the academy, Zoe began to suspect the truth about Nan's death and went to the bathtub where Nan had drowned. She chanted a spell, and the water began to show the scene of Nan's death. Zoe realized that it had all been Fiona and Marie's plot. She told Madison, but Madison didn't care at all. Meanwhile, Cordelia found Queenie and was thrilled to have her back at the academy, but Queenie was still angry about Hank shooting her, saying she was lucky to have learned a new spell that allowed her to spit the bullet out, or she wouldn't have survived. Being shot and surviving made Queenie think she might be the next supreme witch. Cordelia seemed to understand something and said she would keep her eyes open to uncover the truth. Cordelia then went to the kitchen and carefully prepared a potion to restore her sight. Applying it around her eyes, she was losing control and suddenly took out a knife. Digging out her eyes herself, Fiona rushed over after hearing Cordelia's screams, only to find Myrtle standing outside the door, saying that Cordelia was now resting peacefully. Fiona immediately understood what had happened and was deeply disappointed. The blue and brown eyes had been one of her greatest achievements, and now Cordelia had destroyed them. But Cordelia did it all to protect the coven. Afterward, Myrtle sought out Zoe and urged her to take Kyle and leave, warning that staying any longer could put their lives in danger. The coven was now in complete chaos, with internal conflict leaving them not only facing witch hunters but also attacks from within. Zoe swore loyalty to the coven, and Myrtle had once done the same, only to end up burned at the stake. Seeing Zoe's stubbornness, Myrtle slapped her, hoping it would knock some sense into her. Zoe was finally moved by Myrtle's words and decided to elope with Kyle, but Kyle didn't want to leave the place he had come to call home. He was afraid he might hurt Zoe or anyone else. Zoe had no choice but to patiently comfort Kyle, assuring him that they would be happy as long as they were together. Eventually, Kyle was persuaded, and the two ran to the bus station, successfully catching a departing bus. Elsewhere, Fiona and Marie went alone to the witch hunters' headquarters. They showed no respect for the hunters, saying that their presence there was an act of mercy. The head of the witch hunters arrogantly demanded that Fiona sign a 100-year truce. They had surrendered, but Fiona wasn't about to agree to their terms, declaring that only by killing them all would it truly be over. In mere seconds, the top-ranking witch hunters, including their leader, were massacred. Cordelia sacrificed her eyesight to protect the Academy's witches from any harm. She tried to touch Madison, hoping to find some useful clues, but Madison knew she had secrets and used magic to avoid Cordelia's touch. Even though she was blind, Cordelia was still the headmistress, so Madison reluctantly allowed her to touch her. But to Cordelia's surprise, her second sight suddenly failed when it came to Madison. Meanwhile, Queenie went to the kitchen where Cordelia had gouged out her eyes. Finding the table covered in blood, she discovered a strange spellbook and took it with her. Learning its contents after just a quick glance, Queenie chanted a spell, and suddenly, another Queenie appeared. Yes, with magic, Queenie's spirit had left her body, and in the blink of an eye, she found herself back at the fried chicken restaurant where she used to work. Queenie looked confused, and before she could figure out what was happening, Papa appeared before her. Queenie had come looking for him. She wanted Papa to lift Delphine's immortality curse, but Papa said that Delphine's soul wasn't his and turned to leave. He advised Queenie to hurry back, warning that if the sun rose, she would be trapped there forever. Queenie suddenly woke up, finding Papa standing before her. Papa told her that as long as Marie was alive, Delphine would never be able to die. Furthermore, he said he couldn't kill Marie because they had a deal. At that moment, Marie was being held captive by Delphine, who had dismembered her into 50 pieces. Queenie then went to the museum to find Delphine and discovered that Delphine had already killed the museum curator and taken his place. Queenie had always been Delphine's sworn enemy, and despite being a witch, Queenie had never earned Delphine's respect. Just a few words were enough to enrage Queenie, who rushed forward and seriously injured Delphine. Late at night, two witches went to the cemetery with plans to dig up an ancestor's grave. Under Cordelia's guidance, Queenie used magic on the wall. With the help of powerful magic, a large coffin burst through the wall. Inside the coffin lay Misty, motionless and without a single breath. Queenie then chanted a spell and cast magic over Misty. Meanwhile, Zoe and Kyle, who had left on a bus, suddenly returned, much to Myrtle's shock. She insisted that Zoe shouldn't have come back during such a dangerous time but instead should have traveled the world with Kyle. Just as she finished speaking, Misty, who had been resurrected, walked through the door and slapped Madison. It turned out that Madison had killed Misty just a few days ago. Misty didn't hold back, and the two women quickly grabbed each other's hair and began fighting. At that moment, the Axemen suddenly appeared. Despite their internal conflicts, the witches of the Academy united against him. With a mere gesture, the Axeman was flung away. They noticed that the Axeman was covered in blood, but it wasn't his own. Cordelia touched the bloodstains on the floor and was instantly horrified it was Fiona's blood. It turned out that the Axeman had found Fiona, caught her off guard, and killed her with his axe. In the Axeman's memories, Cordelia also saw that Fiona's body had been dismembered and dumped in a swamp, where it was devoured by roaming alligators. Even though Misty had resurrection abilities, Fiona's body was too damaged for her to help. The students of the Coven, overcome with rage, joined forces and killed the Axemen. The walls of the Academy's hall displayed portraits of all the past Supreme Witches, and Fiona's picture was placed by Cordelia in the center. The death of the old Supreme Witch meant that a new one was about to emerge. Cordelia reminded the witches to prepare for the tests. All those remaining at the Academy had to undergo the trials of magic. Only by passing all of them could they qualify to become the new Supreme Witch. The trials were notoriously difficult. The first round was telekinesis. Misty, who excelled at resurrection, was the first to compete, and the other three witches didn't lag behind. They all completed the test. There were 4 witches competing for the title, and the second trial was mind control. Myrtle instructed them to use their willpower to control others. Misty focused all her energy on Queenie. Queenie became furious and ended up pulling Misty's hair. The showdown between Madison and Zoe was different. Madison calmly stared at Zoe, while Kyle was under her control. She made Kyle kneel and kiss her feet. Zoe, feeling enraged, fought back by commanding Kyle to come to her. The third test was astral projection. With the 4 witches lying down to undergo the trial, they needed to enter the underworld, and if they didn't return before sunrise, they would die for real. Myrtle pulled out a large hourglass and told the witches to chant a spell to descend into the underworld. Queenie quickly returned from the afterlife thanks to her previous experience, and Madison and Zoe soon followed. The 3 of them easily completed the test, but Misty couldn't wake up from her nightmare. In a school lab, Misty was repeatedly forced to dissect and revive a frog by a teacher, an endless cycle that broke her spirit. The others realized something was wrong with Misty, but they were helpless, and they watched as Misty disintegrated into ash. The trial resulted in Misty's death, but Cordelia told the remaining 3 witches to proceed to the 4th test. Myrtle announced that the next challenge was transmutation. As she spoke, Zoe suddenly appeared behind Madison. They teleported back and forth, touching each other, flashing in and out of various corners of the room. But during one of Zoe's attempts, she made a mistake, teleporting onto a wrought iron fence, where a sharp spike impaled her. Although the others managed to free Zoe from the fence, she was already dead, and even Queenie's magic couldn't revive her. The only chance to save Zoe was through Madison, but she refused to help. Furious, Cordelia disqualified Madison from the competition. Madison went back to her room to pack her things and leave, but Kyle appeared. Enraged by Madison's refusal to save Zoe, he strangled Madison to death to avenge Zoe. Meanwhile, Zoe was revived by Cordelia's magic. Oddly enough, Cordelia's vision was restored at the same moment. The three witches realized that Cordelia was likely the new supreme witch. Afterward, Myrtle confessed her sins to Cordelia, admitting that she had killed 2 members of the council and asking Cordelia to execute her. Cordelia was filled with sorrow and wanted to act as if nothing had happened. But Myrtle was resolute in her decision. Under Cordelia's guidance, Myrtle was once again tied to the stake, and as the flames consumed her, she turned to ashes. Returning to the academy, Cordelia used her second sight to review Fiona's final days. She saw that Fiona had staged her death at the hands of the Axeman. Hoping it would unite the coven, Cordelia found Fiona, now aged, who asked her to kill her and absorb all the powers of the Supreme Witch. But in the end, Cordelia couldn't bring herself to kill her mother. Instead, they embraced. The next day, Cordelia led Zoe and Queenie outside to greet the new witches. Hundreds of young witches flooded into the hall, curiously gazing at Cordelia. Finally, Cordelia welcomed all the new witches with a smile.